Support comes from Clipper Vacations, offering getaways on the Clipper Fast Ferry to beautiful Victoria, BC. Fares from $135 with promo code WEEKDAY. Terms and conditions apply. Details and booking at clippervacations.com.
This podcast is free, and it's accessible to everyone thanks to support from listeners like you. If you value this show, please consider supporting its production by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute to give, and you'll be helping to support the production of this podcast. Make a donation at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thanks!
For decades, Boeing's safety reputation was bulletproof. It seemed like the company could do no wrong.
Boeing and its international team of partners are truly creating a new airplane for a new world.
But for years now, Boeing has been in a tailspin.
Another bad week and a brutal year for Boeing.
A terrifying situation unfolding in the sky. Take a look at this.
And that plane was almost new. It had been delivered by the manufacturer Boeing around 2 months earlier. And that's too soon for a sneaker to fall apart, let alone a multi-million-dollar aircraft.
So what happened? How did America's airplane manufacturer take such a dramatic nosedive? Spoiler alert, it has something to do with the strange economics of building airplanes. To dig into this, I went to an economics professor who's been trying to explain this stuff to me my whole life. Except this time, I paid attention.
That would be nice.
From KUOW in Seattle, I'm Monica Nickelsburg.
And I'm Joshua McNichols.
For Booming Father's Day edition, I'm bringing in a special guest to answer these questions. My dad.
LA departure frequency 123.9er.
Roger. Hi.
Flight 209er clear for vector 324.
We have clearance, Clarence. Roger, roger. What's our vector, Victor?
Tower radio clearance over. That's Clarence over. Over. Roger. Huh? Roger, over. What? Huh?
Monica, it's almost Father's Day, and we've got a special guest in the studio, your dad. Why did you want to have a conversation with him?
Well, I've been covering Boeing for a while now, and it feels like we have these assumptions about why airplanes are built the way that they are, but it actually seems kind of wonky to me, and I wanted to talk to an expert who could explain like the very, very basics of why we do things the way that we do. And my dad just happens to be that expert. You know, he's an economist at UCLA right now. He directs the Anderson School of Business's economic forecast, but he's been researching the economics of commercial aviation for decades. He was an aviation consultant for Delta and American and Lockheed Martin. And when I was little, he worked as an exec for McDonnell Douglas and Boeing.
I think it's so cool that you ended up an economics reporter when he was so deep into economics, too.
I know. I would not have predicted that, especially as a rebellious teenager, but we'll get into that later. So I caught up with him to just find out how Boeing got into this mess and what it means for the way that everything's going to be built going forward. Dad, welcome to Booming.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Monica, and to be on Booming, talking about something that I've been working on basically my whole life.
Ironically, something that you have tried to talk to me about many times, but this time I'm going to try to pay closer attention than I did as a teenager.
That would be nice.
So, Dad, you've been obsessed with airplanes my whole life. I remember the little model airplanes in your office and learning that those weren't actually toys when I was very young. But I don't think I've ever asked you why you got into planes in the first place.
I've not only been obsessed with airplanes your whole life, but also my whole life. I remember as a child, I would go to the end of the runway at Washington National Airport, was now Reagan Airport, and just sit at the end of the runway and watch airplanes take off and land. It was just fascinating. When I was in the Scouts, we stayed at an Air Force base in Fort Riley, Kansas, and we snuck out at night, myself and a friend, and we lay on the end of the runway with the fighter jets landing basically on top of us. And it was just really fascinating. So when I became an economist and I was on the faculty of USC and had the opportunity to go into aerospace, I just jumped at it because This is something that, I don't know, has always fascinated me.
I love that image of you as a little kid, and it's easy for me to picture now because I have a toddler. I can't say that I've ever really shared your fascination with airplanes until I had my son, and now, like, anytime one goes overhead, I'm like, airplane, airplane, did you guys see that? It's kind of embarrassing if your kid isn't around because, like, nobody else really cares, but there is, like, this just childhood wonder and fascination with these giant machines that somehow manage to lift off like they're weightless, and I can see that. The reason we're having this conversation is because of the now infamous door plug blowout on a Boeing plane. And I think until this story surfaced, a lot of people didn't even realize how many different parts of an airplane are manufactured in different places. So I wonder if we could start by just having you explain, maybe like I'm a kid again, how airplane manufacturing actually works.
Sure. So let's take the manufacturing and think of it in three parts. And the first part is the engineering, and that's a huge part, and that takes many years. You have to design each system. You have to design the lavatory system, the climate control systems, the flight control systems, and there are many, many systems. It takes hundreds, if not thousands, of engineers, years to develop that and make sure that that integrates. That's the first part. The second part is having the components manufactured, and then on the assembly line, they are one by one put into the airplane. So that is the assembly. But then the third part of manufacturing is installing the software systems which run everything. And so that development of the software systems takes quite a long time. And as we know from software, you have updates all the time. Software tends to be very complicated, and you're always refining it to make it work better. And so those are the three parts of manufacturing an aircraft. And to get to that point, the first and third that I just described, the engineering of all of the systems and the software to integrate those systems has to be done before you start building the first prototype of the aircraft. And that takes 5 to 7 years and costs billions of dollars.
Yeah, so I want to understand how airplane manufacturing has changed over time, because obviously Boeing has been in the news a ton lately. It seems like every week there's another headline that cites a different reason for the safety crisis, right? Focusing on profits over engineering, outsourcing so many aspects of manufacturing, moving the headquarters away from Seattle, which is a very hot button topic here. The list goes on. But I want to know why Boeing did those things in the first place. Like, is it really just this brand of greed is good capitalism that we've been living with since the 80s, or were there bigger pressures on the company?
So we're focusing on Boeing today because of the recent problems that Boeing has had, but it's not unique to Boeing. The manufacture of a new airplane doesn't start when the parts arrive at the factory in Everett or Renton and then go through the assembly process. It starts many years before the first airplane is built. And it's very expensive. So you think about maybe a 5 to 7 year development process, which costs billions of dollars. And then you don't see the return for many, many years after the first airplane has actually come off the assembly line. That is a huge risk. And so back in the late 80s, early 90s, manufacturers of aircraft started doing risk sharing with their suppliers as a way of laying off some of the risk so that if the airplane project was not successful, it wouldn't take the company out of the business.
The 787 also represents a brand new business model for Boeing. The company has brought in dozens of partners from all over the world to build the plane. The companies will not only supply parts, but will have major responsibilities for design work. They will also help pay for the development of the plane, expected to run into the billions of dollars.
You talked about it being really risky to develop a new airplane, and I know that there have been times in Boeing's history when it was like potentially going to put them out of business trying to make the next great airplane. But help me understand that risk, because I know from conversations with aviation experts that airlines have to replace their fleets every 10 to 15 years to remain competitive. So If that's the case, why is it so risky to develop a new airplane? Like, isn't it pretty much guaranteed that airlines are going to buy whatever Boeing makes?
It is not, because by the time you bring the aircraft to market, it may not be the product that airlines want. And yes, they do have to replace their airplanes, but you have competitors who are offering other products. And so the history of commercial air transports is one of many products that came to market that actually did not succeed, including in recent times. There are two good examples, the Airbus A380, which lost money, and Bombardier's C-Series, that they ended up selling the whole program to Airbus for $1 because they went bankrupt on the program. So it is risky. You don't know what airlines are going to demand 7, 8, 9, 10 years in the future. So you're taking a bet on that.
Okay, I have another supply and demand question. You might remember that I refused to take econ in high school because I was rebellious. So help me out here.
I remember it well.
If there's basically limitless demand for commercial airplanes from airlines around the world, then why are there only two main suppliers, Boeing and Airbus?
The reason why we see only two suppliers is that there simply isn't a market for more suppliers, for more variety in aircraft. So if you think about, for example, the 737 aircraft, it has one competitor, the A320 aircraft made by Airbus, and they divide up the market. That gives them sufficient demand for each of their products in order to earn an appropriate rate of return on the billions of dollars that they've invested in developing those airplanes. If you were to divide that market in 3 ways or 4 ways or more so that you had many competitors, you wouldn't have any of the manufacturers earning enough to actually make it worthwhile to invest, say, $10 billion in 5 years in the development of an airplane.
Interesting. So what you're saying is that the only way to make your money back as an airplane manufacturer, because you spend so much of it, is to only have one other competitor and you two just share all the spoils?
And that's just because of the size of the market. When you get to the very large aircraft, say the Boeing 747 and the Airbus A380, that's a very small market. And in fact, there was only room for one aircraft in that market, which is why the Airbus A380 was not a successful program.
Okay, well, with all of Boeing's safety problems over the past few months, why can't a customer like Alaska Airlines just go to Airbus for its next order?
Well, that's one of the things about having only two suppliers. Aircraft are ordered years in advance by airlines because they're planning to roll over a fleet. And rolling over a fleet itself is fairly complicated. You're taking aircraft out of the fleet, replacing them with new aircraft. That means a whole lot of adjustment in terms of which pilots you have flying the aircraft and where they're flying and your parts inventory and so on. And so airlines order their aircraft well in advance. And today, Airbus is sold out. Boeing is also sold out. But airlines can't just very easily pivot and get the aircraft that they need.
Do you think that it's sustainable for a company making something as complex as airplanes to continue to have so many different suppliers working on small parts of it and then just assembling the airplane in Renton at the end?
Well, it's a business decision in terms of cost, but I think the Boeing company has indicated that they're going to reduce that in order to bring many things in-house that they can then control directly instead of relying on suppliers who they are asking to deliver components at lower cost, of course. And so I think that is going to be a trend.
Yeah, so is that something that manufacturers of complex technology and equipment need to keep in mind going forward, that you can't really cut corners? You have to make the thing that you make yourself?
I think that's one of the object lessons that we get from the struggles that the Boeing company is going through right now, that as we move forward in manufacturing, and this is advanced manufacturing, it's technological manufacturing, that one has to have more control over these complex systems. I think the manufacturing of aircraft is just a leading indicator of the kind of manufacturing that we're going to see in the future. An aircraft is a collection of parts, but it's also very importantly a system of software packages. That's the most difficult part of manufacturing. And, kind of the issues that you see with the Boeing company at the moment, the complexity of putting all of this code together and making sure it works properly. And that's going to be an issue with many, many products that we use in the future.
You fly a lot, Dad. Has any of this made you think differently about stepping onto an airplane?
No.
Not at all?
No, not at all.
Not even a MAX?
No. The reason is that the aircraft are perfectly safe. They're not maybe being manufactured to the quality standards that are being demanded today. But the basic aeronautics of how an airplane takes off, flies through the sky, and lands is fairly straightforward. And we've known that for many decades. And so I have no concern about getting on the airplane.
All right. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Dad, I'm so glad that you joined us on your booming debut, and I hope you'll come back to the show.
I would like that. It's been fun to be here on Take Your Dad to Work Day, and would be delighted to join Booming in the future.
I'm still fascinated that you've come around to economics just like your dad. And it kind of gives me some hope, as a father who's constantly trying to get my 15-year-old daughter to get excited about great journalism.
There is hope. Maybe one day. It might take a while, but I think she'll come around.
Okay, well, we began with this question of, why has America's top airplane manufacturer taken a nosedive? And from this conversation, I've learned that developing an airplane is risky and expensive, and industry analysts like your dad feel there's only room for two big manufacturers to make their money back. And this led Boeing to rely on outside manufacturers because somehow this spreads out the risk, and relying on outside manufacturers led to safety problems, which is why Boeing's been in a tailspin lately. And I'm hearing that Boeing wants to turn this around and get back more control of its manufacturing process. It kind of reminds me of how Apple wants to keep control of the iPhone. That's how it wants to keep quality up.
Yeah.
And Boeing wants to do the same thing. Theoretically, it would keep quality high.
Yes, I think Boeing would love if its airplanes worked like iPhones right now.
I do wonder about something, though. And I know that a lot of the safety problems with Boeing planes came about because Boeing was riding its suppliers so hard and basically forcing them to cut corners or lose their contracts. Some of the resulting problems from that are really Boeing's responsibility. And it's unclear to me why bringing manufacturing back in-house will necessarily improve their planes. It feels like the core issue is the cost-cutting culture. So I don't know. Does that seem like a relevant question for you?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. And I think both things can be true. I think that Boeing and Airbus and, the companies that have set out to do this really remarkable thing, building these modern high-tech airplanes, they are under a ton of pressure. It's a huge challenge. And so that pressure kind of trickles down into putting pressure on their suppliers or just, pressure to perform financially while doing this thing that's really a moonshot. At the same time, Boeing did spend decades prioritizing profits over engineering. So the first, I think, is actually pretty straightforward to address. You bring manufacturing back in-house, you have more control over it, you can do more quality control because it's all happening sort of under the same roof. Bonus points if you move the headquarters back to where the manufacturing is done so the decision makers can be close to the engineers. But the harder thing to change is the company culture, right? Whether Boeing can do that, can really transform itself back into a company that says engineering is our priority and profits are secondary, I think remains an open question.
Fascinating.
That's it for Booming. Do you have a question for Joshua or me? Email us at booming@kuow.org.
Yeah, and we always like to thank our listeners who support KUOW financially because, you're the reason we have this podcast. So if you want to donate, go to kuow.org/donate/booming. And thanks.
Yes, thank you, listeners, and thank you to our producers, Lucy Suchek and Whitney Henry Lester. Our editor is Carol Smith. I'm Monica Nickelsburg.
And I'm Joshua McNichols.
And we'll catch you next time.